I invite you to open your Bibles to the book of Job. I know that we've been looking at scenes and themes from the Gospels, but I want to conclude this series by looking at a man who foreshadows Jesus. When I first became a Christian, I started scouring the internet for websites of churches so that I could listen to the sermons that were done on them, and I happened across gospel meeting sermons. And there's one series of lessons that I had listened to, and I remember the last sermon in the gospel meeting, this guy that had this deep Texas accent or something got up and said, "Well, it's been a 10-pound meeting. I have gained 10 pounds by your hospitality." I hope that's not the case, but the hospitality and the kindness that you guys have shown, and when I first heard that, I'm like, what is a gospel meeting, and what does that mean? And I understand what that means now, and it's because of the kindness that people like you have shown to us this week. Mickey and Donna have been great hosts. Abigail has connected with them and made good friends. I think the only thing she can say to Mickey is, "You're silly." But he did take her out on a golf cart ride, and that was silly, I guess, and fun. One of the things that I very badly, my wife and I, want to be able to give our children is what we never had growing up, which is Christian family, Christian community. And so I thank you guys for depositing some love towards Abigail and for helping her create good memories that are in the context of being at an assembly with God's people. That means a lot to me, and so I thank you guys for being part of that and interacting with her and letting this be a good time together. She's just tired right now, if anybody was wondering. If she's fine, but she's just tired. It's been a long week for her, and so she stayed up a little bit past her bedtime and had fun with that. But I appreciate very much the conversations, the kindness, the encouraging dialogue about various topics in the Scripture. I've learned a lot from you guys, and so I pray that this has been mutually beneficial, but I know that when we leave, Lord willing, shortly after services, because we're driving back tonight, that I'll be leaving built up by all of you, and I'm thankful to God for that kind of encouragement that we can get in the Lord. There's a variety of trials that people can experience. And the difficulty of a trial is always subjective to where you are in life. Whatever is difficult for you is difficult for you. Have you ever had anybody try to one-up your suffering, though? Where you say, I'm really struggling with such and such. Well, I've struggled with that times a million more than you ever had to go through. You're like, oh, okay, thank you. So you had to walk uphill both ways, in the ice, to school, without shoes on and everything. So you had it worse than me. That's really comforting for me to know that. How are we supposed to handle difficult trials? It's not, and how are we supposed to help one another with these sorts of things? It's not by one-upping one another in this. There is a passage in the New Testament, though, that directs us to the book of Job. In James chapter 5, verses 10 and 11, where it says, "As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." Have you obeyed what this passage is telling you to do? As an example of patience and suffering, in whatever it is that you deal with, in whatever burdens you have to bear, have you gone back and took the endurance and the example of endurance that we can read about in the prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Job is specifically mentioned here, and thought to yourself, what? I need to learn some things about the steadfastness that these people had. What is steadfastness? I always think the mental image that I have of steadfastness is the way that the Greek gods pictured Atlas, the god that's holding up the world. And I don't know if that's where the phrase "don't drop the ball" comes from, but he better not drop the ball, otherwise we're all dead. But that god's not real anyway, so we don't have to worry about that. But the idea of steadfastness or endurance means that I can bear up under a heavy load, and the way that I know that I'm steadfast is if I'm not justifying sin in the middle of the difficulty. As soon as I start justifying sin and saying, well, it's okay that I'm bitter, it's okay that I flew off the handle, you don't know what I was going through anyways, it's the moment that I've stopped being patient. To be steadfast is to not drop the ball. Why is James saying this to this audience? Like the audience of 1 Peter that we talked a little bit about yesterday, this audience has been scattered from their homelands. They're going through a lot of difficulties. In chapter 4, some of the brethren are at each other's throats. Some of them have health problems in chapter 5, and they need the elders to pray over them. And there's different ways that people look at that passage. But they're experiencing economic problems. They're going through a lot of difficult things. And here's what James is saying. Let's just say what he's saying this way. In the midst of your difficulties, do not neglect deep Bible study. Isn't that what he's saying here? As an example of patience and endurance and steadfastness, go back and study Hosea. Go back and study Jeremiah. Go back and study books like the book of Job. In your difficulties and your trials, do you find that prayer is the easiest thing that comes in your life? Does it come to the neglect of deep Bible study about people like Job? And so I want us, in this lesson, the best we can with the time that we have, try to help us obey what James is saying here, is to think about this man as an example of patience and suffering. The book of Job opens up by telling us several things about him, that he's from the land of Uz. That's not one of the lands that's named in the distribution in Joshua, like 13 through 21. And so the land of Uz would maybe indicate that he was sometime after the flood, but before the call of Abraham, showing that God may have had dealings with other people before Abraham was ever called. But Abraham, of course, is the one through whom the promises are going to come, things like that. But there was other people that seemed to understand who the Lord was. And so this man is somebody who, according to the first few verses of Job, fears God and turns away from evil, shuns evil. Have you ever noticed how the wisdom books, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, have you ever noticed how these books have a conversation with one another? So when the book of Job begins by saying that Job fears God, what does the book of Proverbs tell us about the person who fears God? Well, they're a wise person. These books complement each other in different kinds of ways. So he fears God. He's a wise person. His spiritual life is in order. But look at his physical blessings as well. 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels. That's a lot. Driving around here, Abigail and I in the car, she's noticed the different livestock, even more than what we've seen in Bowling Green. But I haven't seen a farm, to my knowledge, with that many animals. And if he had an Instagram account and he was posting all of the pictures of his great livestock and everything, you'd also see that he's got a really good family life as well. He's got 7 sons and 3 daughters, 7 being one of the numbers of perfection. 3 is one of those good numbers in the Bible as well. You add those together, you get 10, a number of completion. Job's family life is just perfect and beautiful as well. This would be the guy that everybody's jealous of, which makes him the perfect candidate for what's going to happen in this book. Look at Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. Now, before I read this, I want to point out something about the first couple chapters of Job. Have you ever noticed in the first couple chapters of Job that this book, it toggles between what's happening on earth, what's happening in the heavenly realm, what's happening on earth, what's happening in the heavenly realm? So if the first 5 verses tell us about the earthly life of Job, now we get transported into the spiritual realm, and look what happens in Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." This is an interesting passage. You've got God in this heavenly council. And what does that look like in the spiritual realm? I don't know, but just imagine this big table that God is around, and he's got this council that he doesn't need, but he chooses to use. And I don't know what they're discussing, the things that are happening on earth. It's interesting that in the heavenly realm, they're always talking, it seems, in the Bible about what's happening on earth, and us on earth are always wondering what's happening in the spiritual realm. But here comes Satan to this council. And God initiates this conversation with Satan. Where have you gone? In all of your going and doing, all the places that you've gone on earth, did you notice my servant Job, that he's blameless and upright? So here's God affirming what we learned about Job at the beginning of the book, that this guy's got really great character. And do you, by the way, in the spiritual realm, want God initiating a conversation with Satan about you? I mean, does this happen today where Satan comes before God and God says, hey, have you noticed that Southside Church of Christ? Have you noticed X, Y, or Z member of that church, that those people are blameless and upright? Do you want God doing that, bringing attention to a particular person? Well, then Satan says, well, yeah, I did happen to notice him, and he is blameless and upright, but my interpretation of it is, God, that the only reason he's like that is because you've given him a lot of goodies. You've blessed him in all of these different sorts of ways with his wealth and with his family, and all the work of his hands have increased more and more. You've put this hedge around him and protected him. Who wouldn't serve you if they were going to get all those kinds of goodies from you? And he says, but if you let me stretch out my hand against him, he will curse you to your face. What does it mean to curse God to his face? I think the idea of cursing God in the book of Job is to renounce your relationship with God. I'm done with you, God, is kind of the idea. Which brings up an interesting question in the book of Job. Would you serve God for nothing? If all of the goodies you had were removed and stripped away from you, would you still, as long as you have breath in your lungs, want to serve the Lord? Now take this language to its most extreme logical conclusion. Would you serve God for nothing? If you knew that you were going to go to hell, it was locked in place, would you still serve God? I'm not saying that that scenario would be a real one, but I'm saying hypothetically, if you knew you were going to go to hell, would you still see that the right thing to do with your life would be that you would serve God because you're acknowledging that he's still the one that's got authority and power and all these different sorts of things that would demand submission? Would you serve God if everything in your life was stripped away, even your sense of hope in the afterlife was stripped away? Well, what does God do? Look at Job chapter 1, verse 12. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So here's God allowing this test. When God allows this test at the beginning, he says to him, don't touch him yet. Against him, don't put out your hand. In other words, don't mess up his health right now. But yeah, disrupt his life. And Satan, I'm going to use Job as a case study for you to know that I'm worth serving no matter what's taken from somebody's life, because evidently Satan doesn't think that that would be true. Now, before we look at the things in Job's life that are disrupted, don't you like that the beginning of this book shows us that Job was a righteous man? Again, think about how the wisdom books talk to each other. Generally, in the book of Proverbs, if you do the right thing, good things will happen to you. But then Job comes along and Ecclesiastes comes along and says, but that's not always the case. Have you ever had a time before where some terrible thing happened and you kept thinking to yourself, it must be because I made some wrong decision, it must be because I did something wrong? And sometimes that's true according to Proverbs, but according to Job, is that always the case? Not always. What is it that Satan messes up in the life of Job? Now, I'm not the kind of preacher that tries to make everything start with the same letter in every sermon. But there are some times where it does work, and in the book of Job, there are 4 things that begin with the letter F that Satan messes up in the life of Job. And the first one are his finances. Look at Job chapter 1, starting in verse 13. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. And the Sabeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. This is a bad day, and there's going to be a fourth messenger in just a moment, but notice that the messengers go between, well, there was a group of people that attacked a bunch of things, and then there was this, the fire from God, there was people, and then some kind of natural event, and then the next guy, there is some kind of people that attack some things, and the fourth one in just a moment is going to be another natural event. So they're going between these 2 different kinds of things in this text. But in this time period, your wealth was bound up in your animals. When you shear the sheep, you get the wool together and you sell it. When you milk the cows, that's what some of the ways that you make your money, all these, and all the different kind of animals that they would have had and all the ways that they would have made money from it. And he finds out in one moment that his portfolio has been liquidated. You remember in the 2008 stock market crash? There were some people that had so much wealth and hope bound up on Wall Street that some of the people who lost everything literally committed suicide. Have you ever known a whack-a-mole family? Do you ever play the game whack-a-mole? It's got a really good name, the game does, because you whack a mole, and then another one comes up and you have to whack the next mole. Have you ever known a whack-a-mole family? And you guys all know what I mean by that, right? Where, of course I have to explain it. Where there's a family that it doesn't seem like they've done anything wrong, but cancer comes. And then it seems like that problem is solved, and then constant car problems. And then they seem like they get that problem solved, but then they got some other problem that surfaces, and it's just like one thing after another after another. There was a family like that at the church in California, and we started studying together, and after several things had not gone well with them, I got together with them, and I said, so how are you guys doing today? And they said, well, there's another thing. Our identity was stolen, and all of our money was liquidated. If all your wealth was taken away, if all of your hope of wealth was removed in one way or another, would you still serve God? Would you still see that He's worthy of being served? You remember in the book of Revelation, in Revelation 13, there's the mark of the beast, which had meaning to the original audience. I don't think the meaning of the mark of the beast are the kinds of things that you hear on radio programs today that try to talk about the Bible, but they get a lot of it wrong. What is the mark of the beast, though? The mark of the beast is you're owned by the beast. He's put his mark of ownership on you. He's got his name on you. And if you bow down to the Roman Empire and you believe the things they tell you to believe, then you can buy, sell, or trade. But if you don't have the mark of the beast, then you're not going to be able to buy, sell, or trade. Have you felt this more in our culture now? That not that Revelation is being fulfilled in our culture right now. I think it had first century meaning, but these ideas are starting to surface. Are there people that are in danger of losing their jobs today if they hold to biblical worldviews? Where you might not be able to get as much business as you used to. If people find out what you really believe about the watershed issues in our culture today. If serving God meant that you were going to make a little bit less money because of that, maybe a lot less money because of that, would you still serve Him? Or would you start to cave? So this is the first thing. Notice the next thing that happens with Job is his family. And this gets subdivided into 2 different ways. We start with his children. Keep reading in verses 18 and 19. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house. And it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Some people might say, all right, Job, well, you lost all of your money, but at least you have your family. And then the fourth messenger comes and says, by the way, your family's gone too now. Every mom and dad wants the kids to get along well with each other. And when kids are at each other's throats, it's one of those things that brings a lot of turmoil to mom and dad. Notice that in this passage, all 10 kids are together in one place having some kind of festivity. They're all getting along with each other. And something like a tornado comes and they all die. My wife and I, between Asher and Abigail, she had a miscarriage. And it was on a Sunday morning at around 4 or 5 a.m. that she had the miscarriage. And I woke up, and Samantha wasn't in the bed, and then I walk out to the living room, and she's like on the ground having contractions, and she gives birth in the living room to a kid that we never knew. And that kind of thing is difficult, even when it's a child that we never got to meet. One day, Lord willing, we will. Can you imagine 10 grown children that you've had years to get to know all die in one moment? When Samantha and I first moved to Tennessee, there was a guy at the church named Sean Kaplinger, and he was 36 years old, and he had AIDS. And you might think, okay, well, if somebody's got AIDS, it's because they made some kind of mistake in their life, right? Not always. He was born with hemophilia. And when he was 8, he had a blood transfusion, and the blood donor had AIDS. So here's a kid, through no fault of his own, contracts AIDS, and when we moved to Tennessee, he's in hospice care. 2 weeks after we moved there, he dies. And every week, the father, Jim, wants to get together with me, and he is crying every time we get together, and he keeps saying how God has still been good to him for him to have had the time with his son. God was still good to him, and he wants to be able to see Sean one day in the afterlife. If you had some of your children pass away unexpectedly, or if you had a child that apostatized, however you say that, they fell away, would you start to maybe change your convictions about what's right or wrong and defer to the child rather than deferring to what the Scripture says? And in that way, start to fall away yourself because you just want to think that they're actually okay with the Lord. If there's some way in another where your children let you down or they die, would you still serve the Lord? Well, look further in chapter 2. And look at verses 9 and 10, what happens with his wife. And remember that Satan was able to mess up anything in Job's life. He kills all the children, but the wife he keeps alive. And I think we see why in verses 9 and 10. Look at Job chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" And all of this Job did not sin with his lips. Do you remember what Satan said in Job chapter 1, verse 11? God, if I can wreck Job's life, he'll curse you to your face. He will do it. And what is Mrs. Job saying here? Curse him, curse him, curse him. Do you see that Mrs. Job has become the mouthpiece of Satan? She's encouraging Job to do the very thing that Satan wants Job to do. I think for a long time I had a misunderstanding of Mrs. Job. I still have a negative view of her, but it's not as negative as it used to be. Do you think Mrs. Job is suffering quite a bit too? Her children are dead. Her farm is gone too. They're both suffering together. And I think when she says, "Job, just curse God and die," it's as if she's saying, just do a mercy killing. Just tell God you renounce him, you're done with him, and he'll send lightning and zap you, and all the suffering is going to be gone. I think she's got misguided compassion on Job. But nonetheless, she's still not encouraging his faith. Anybody here, I don't know everybody's story here, but anybody here, every time you get into your car and you're driving out of your driveway, you can look in the rearview mirror at somebody in your family looking at you driving off, and they're shaking their head going, why do you keep doing these things? Somebody that's not encouraging your faith. If you had some family member that kept trying to tell you that what you're doing was wrong, you ought not be doing these things, would you cave to the pressure, or would you keep serving God? And while I'm on this point, let me just say this. The biggest reason that I've seen in my vast 15 years of being a Christian, the biggest thing that I've seen cause young people to fall away is the pursuit of a spouse. They go to their local church, and for one reason or another, there's no romantic matches that can be found, and they start lowering their standards and find somebody that pulls them away from the Lord. If for you, serving the Lord meant that you might need to be single a little bit longer, would you still do it? Notice the next one. Go back a little bit in chapter 2 and notice that Job's flesh is affected. Look at Job chapter 2, starting in verse 4. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, all that a man has, he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Somebody might say, well, Job, you've lost your finances, but you still have your family. Actually, you don't. But at least you still have your health or your flesh. But actually, no, you don't now either. Round one is done. His finances, his children have been killed. But now Satan's got this theory that, all right, God, if I can wreck his health, his whole life can be disrupted, but there's something entirely different about somebody's health being put in danger. That'll cause people to just act in very erratic ways. Do you think Satan knows that by experience? Satan can do anything he wants to Job's body, and what he chooses to do is give him sores. These boils, I think as some versions say. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. How painful must those have been? For him to have free range on Job's body, and that's what he chooses to do to him, must have been absolutely terrible. Since becoming a Christian, one of the things that I've liked to do is peruse bookstores and see you see the air quotes here, the Christian section, and just see for a couple years at a time, there'll be some kind of theme that Christian writers write about. You know, there's been this thing about hospitality that was done a few years ago, and a lot of books written about hospitality, and then there's other books that are written about, say, the book of Daniel or something like that, whatever. And so they come in these waves. And I remember maybe around 2013, 2015, there was a bunch of people writing books about your physical health as it relates to the Bible. And so there was Body Built by God. And there was the Daniel fast. And if I eat the same food as Daniel, then I'll be healthy and all this kind of stuff. And nobody yet, if you want to make $1 million, here's a really good book idea that nobody's written yet, is the John the Baptist diet book. The Locusts and Wild Honey. There's a lot of money left on the table. You know what's wrong with those kinds of books is they say if you decode these things in the Bible, you can be healthy. Until you get somebody like Job, who's a righteous man, and his health is completely wrecked. Would we keep serving God if our health started to deteriorate? Would we keep serving God if the threat of our health was a real threat? Would we keep serving God? Or would we fall to pieces? Notice the last one are Job's friends. Look at Job chapter 2, verse 11. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, and they made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and to comfort him. Now we know that these friends are not remembered well, but I want you to think about the kind of faith that they had to even come to Job. Do you enjoy visiting people in a hospital? You hear everybody coughing in there, and you're worried if you're going to catch something. I mean, that's not a fun experience. It's something that you need to do because you love people, that sort of thing. But this is a time where a tornado came to Job's kids, and there was fire from God, some kind of lightning that came and destroyed some of his animals. Do you want to get into the blast radius of where Job is? You want to get within 100 yards of him when all of these natural kinds of things and these bands of Chaldeans and Sabians have come into the area? For you to even get into the proximity of Job has to show that you really love this guy. These are good friends. But as soon as they open up their mouth, they start to say to Job, well, we all know that those who are righteous have good things happen in their life. And Job, you need to come to terms with the wickedness that you've done, because the only way that these things would have happened in your life is if you did something wicked. So just confess, 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 confess. By the way, how often do we define ourselves based on what other people think about us? Oh, you're a funny person, and now, I'm funny, so I'm supposed to be funny, and I'm going to crack a bunch of Laffy-Taffy jokes and all this sort of, or these people think I'm this way, so I better be this way. Do you know one of the things that's impressive about the tenacity of Job is all throughout the book they say, sinner, 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 you've done something wrong. And all throughout the book he goes, no, I haven't. He's not letting other people's opinion of him define him. This is part of what it means that he held fast to his integrity. How does Job summarize his friends? Look at Job 16. This is one of the ways that he summarizes them in Job 16, verses 1 and 2. Then Job answered and said, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. You guys stink. If you had a friend let you down or misaccuse you of something, would that cause you to fall away? When I was a newer Christian, I had a really good friend named Brian. And I was trying to teach him the gospel. He had started coming to some Bible studies. And my mom and dad always had the habit of becoming friends with my friends. And there was one day he spent the night at our house, and I had to go to work the next morning on that Saturday. And it wasn't unusual for my friends to just stay behind and hang out with my mom and dad for a little bit. So that happened. And after that day, my friend didn't talk to me anymore. And I tried to figure out what's going on, and I asked my mom and dad, hey, do you know what's going on with Brian? Like, he's not talking to me anymore. Oh, yeah, we told him you're part of a cult and to not talk to you anymore. It was one of the hardest, meanest things I think anybody's ever done to me. And it's hard enough when the person's not a Christian, but maybe they're going to become a Christian. What happens when somebody that you go to church with, that you assemble with, stabs you in the back, misaccuses you of something? How many people walk away from the Lord because of those hypocritical people? And apparently, you've got such piercing insight into how people should be, and if you have that piercing insight, you better stay and help us, but no, you got to leave because you're so much better. Have you ever had Christians let you down? It's going to be part of what happens sometimes. We can't put our faith in people, but so many people walk away from the Lord because their friends let them down. What is the verdict in the book of Job? You can start turning to Job 42, and I'll say a couple things about that in just a moment. But what happens at the end of the book of Job is that God comes in the whirlwind to Job and takes Job on a trip to the zoo. He says, you see that dinosaur, you see Leviathan, you see this thing, you see that thing. I made all of that and I take care of it. What about the ostrich? That's a pretty interesting animal. It's got those feathers, but it can't fly. It doesn't take care of its children very well, but somehow the children still make it, all this sort of thing. And so, Job, you've been throughout the book questioning, why are all these things happening? You've even been saying, Job, that if you could have a trial before me, that you would win that trial. Now, Job did not fall away. He did not curse God to his face. But the mistake he made is he got too bold in his questioning of God. But he kept the conversation going all throughout the book. Now remember, Satan's accusation was that he won't serve God if everything is taken away. He won't serve God for nothing. Look at Job 42, verses 5 and 6, after God took him on this trip to the zoo. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. All right, God, I never cursed you, but yeah, I did go too far in how I accused you. And I didn't trust your control of the universe like I should have. I felt like there was this injustice, and I didn't understand why, and I was too bold at certain times to say some of the things that I said. But Satan was never right that he would curse God to his face. Do you notice that Job is repenting in his mansion? No, it didn't say that. It doesn't say he's repenting with all of his wealth restored to him. What is he repenting in? Dust and ashes. God, I never cursed you to your face. I went too far, and I'm going to repent and be quiet in my dust and ashes, realizing that I don't even have the right to question you in the ways that I've been doing. Will I serve God for nothing? Of course I will. I'll keep serving him in the dust and ashes that I sit in. Could you say the same thing? If all these things were stripped away from you, finances, family, flesh, friends, would you still say, God, I went too far in how I questioned you, but I will repent in my dust and ashes. Nothing's been restored in my life. I will serve you no matter what. In Job's case, Satan was wrong, but what about in your life? It's a question that we got to ask ourselves. Do you remember, though, at the beginning of this lesson, how we started out in James chapter 5? And one of the things that James chapter 5 said about the book of Job is you've seen the mercy of the Lord in this book. I don't know about you, but the first time I ever read the book of Job, God's mercy was not the thing that was screaming off the page to me. I was confused by a lot of things. So then James comes along and says, go back and reread Job and try to see God's mercy in it. And if you see God's mercy in it, maybe you'll learn some other lessons from that as well. How do we see God's mercy in the book of Job? Well, if we loop the book of James into this, the book of James ends by talking about steadfastness and thinking about Job, but the book of James begins by talking about steadfastness as well. In James chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. How many of you want to be perfect, complete, lacking nothing? You want to be a mature Christian? Oh yeah, I want that. Do you see the path by which that happens in James chapter 1? It's by being steadfast in the midst of trials. You can think about it like lifting weights. If you've ever lifted weights before, let's say you're doing 4 sets of 10 reps or something like, so you're like, well, okay, 1, 2, 3, up to 10. The sensation that you get when you're lifting weights is that you feel like you're getting weaker. But if you're steadfast and you keep doing the reps and you keep up the discipline, the sensation of feeling like you're getting weaker is a lie, because what's actually happening as you keep doing it is you're getting stronger. Have you felt like your faith has been getting weaker and weaker as it's been tried more and more and more? The truth is if you remain steadfast and you keep lifting the weights and you don't quit, yeah, you feel like you're weak, but if you're not cursing God, the sensation you're experiencing is actually leading to you being strengthened. There's times in the book of Job where Job will question God too much, and then he'll kind of reach this new plane where he'll say something that shows great faith, and you don't see him reverting back. Job 19:25, I know that my Redeemer lives, especially after he makes that statement, he doesn't revert back down again. You can see throughout the book that his understanding is growing and maturing. How does God's mercy get seen in the book of Job? Well, one of the ways that it does this is that God used the trials to help him grow. And you know this in your life, that the times in your life that you've been tested and tried, oft made to wonder, are the same times that if you remain steadfast, that your growth was turbocharged. So I think we see God's mercy in that way in the book of Job, but there's one other way. Look at Job 42, verses 12 and 13. We see that Job's latter days were blessed. Job 42, verses 12 and 13. The Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, and he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. You notice that everything in this passage is doubled except for the children? So you get double the amount of animals and everything. Why not double the amount of children? And there's different theories people have had about that kind of question. The first set of animals that died, are they gone forever? Like, no afterlife for them? Yeah, like they don't have a spirit. There's no afterlife for them. So God doubles the animals. Did Job's children die in chapter 1, though? Yeah, they died. For Job to receive 10 more children is perhaps a dim picture in the book of Job that there is an afterlife because his children were indeed doubled. He never ultimately loses the first 10. He gets 10 more added, and in the afterlife, he's got 20 children. And maybe that's a dim picture in the book of Job about this idea of an afterlife. Is it true that we will be blessed in our latter days? Doesn't have to mean that in this life everything's going to have some kind of reversal. Some of us might be destined the rest of our life to live in all kinds of misery. I had a friend who lived in San Diego, and his wife had been cheating on him. And he knew about it, and he was pleading with her for 2 years to stop. And it brought him to this great, deep depression. And he wasn't suicidal, but he would get on his motorcycle and ride around at night, and he would begin the motorcycle ride by saying, God, I'm not asking you to end my life, but if a semi-truck could be guided towards me, I'm okay with that. And then as he would keep riding, he kept telling himself, there's a Job 42, there's a Job 42, there's a Job 42. And what he meant by that was not that in this life there's going to be some kind of reversal. What he meant by that is one day there will be this afterlife where all of our tears will be wiped away, where we're going to be with the Lord forever, and everything sad and everything wicked in this life will be completely reversed when we get to be with Him forever. And the one that makes that possible is Jesus. Do you see Jesus in the book of Job? Jesus had no finances. He had nowhere to lay his head at night. His family thought that he was out of his mind. His flesh was torn open when he was on the cross, and his friends forsook him in his most trying moment. Perhaps through the eyes of faith, Job looked forward to that man that was coming when he says in Job 19:25, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth." Somehow, some way, Job didn't have all the details of it figured out and revealed to him, but somehow, some way, there was going to be a Redeemer that would vindicate Job. There was going to come a Redeemer that would purchase back those who have sinned before him and repented of it. Throughout this week, we've been looking at scenes and themes in the Gospels. Final question. Who knows more about God? Job in the book of Job, or you all sitting here right now? Which books of the Bible could Job turn to and learn about God? I'm not sure he had any to turn to and learn about God. But we have the full revelation of God. We've been looking at scenes and themes from this Redeemer that did come, that Job had a dim picture of, that we've been seeing in the Gospels, the way that he challenged people, the way that he expected things of people, the kind of joy that he has in having you be his bride. We've been looking at all these things together during these lessons, and we who have a much wider understanding of the Lord, Job had a very narrow understanding of God. We have a wider one. And Job, with his narrow understanding of God, served him when everything was stripped away. Will we who have a much wider understanding of the Lord serve him if anything gets stripped from our life? It has been a pleasure to be with all of you for these last few days. You guys have been a big encouragement to me. This has been a very meaningful time for me and Abigail and I to be with you all. But if there's anybody here tonight that needs to get their life right with God and they need to dedicate themselves, draw inspiration from people like Job. Look at somebody who endured all of these things and lean into his example. And look at how Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of the kinds of things Job had to go through. And he did all of that because he loves you. When I first became a Christian, and when I was on the path to becoming a Christian, it was not difficult for me to believe that God made the world in 6 literal days. If you start with the idea that there's a creator that's over everything, he can have Jonah be swallowed in a fish for 3 days. It's not really difficult to believe that. You know what is difficult in the Bible to believe? And what's always been the most difficult thing in the Bible for me to believe is that God loves me. Because I know my faults and I know my failures, and the reason that I don't want to confess my sins to people is if you found out the things that I've done, then you wouldn't love me anymore. But the Bible teaches that God knows everything about you, everything, which might scare us until we realize he still reached down his hand and he came in the form of a man who suffered in the like manner as Job and died for you. And this song says to follow him. Who else would you follow? Nobody else that you could follow would sacrifice for you in that way. Would you come and follow him while we stand and while we sing?